Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dentistry Unmasked. My name is David Rice, and I'm here as always with.
Hey everybody, Pam Maragliano-Muniz. David, this week is going to be so stinking interesting and it
Yeah,
could be life-changing for one or more people.
I can personally attest to the life-changing potential of this week's episode. Who do we got, Pam?
Okay, so I've heard dentists say this and they say, don't get divorced. And it's not like, oh, don't get divorced. Like, we want you to stay married. They're like, no, don't get divorced because it's just cheaper to stay married. And that seems crazy to me. So I was like, all right, you know what? I need to bring some attorneys up into this piece and tell us what the real scoop is. Is it cheaper to stay married? So with us is Alexander Erwig and Spencer Welch. Welcome, guys.
Welcome. Thanks so much for having us. Great to be with you.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, it's like the Clash. Should I stay or should I go now? Showing my age on
Exactly.
that one.
No, what I got okay, so today my assistant, we had a bowl of hot water and she went to pick it up and it wasn't even hot anymore, but it was like she went to pick it up and throw it away, but she accidentally like dumped it all over the place and got water all over me. And she was horrified and she's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry." And I was like, "No, no, no, it's fine. This witch doesn't melt." And she started to like fakely laugh and I'm like, "Do you even know what I'm talking about?" She's like, "No." And I'm like, this weekend, can you please watch Wizard of Oz? Because I don't like feeling that old. So watch a movie once in a while. Anyway,
Divorce her.
I might have to. Or
A
maybe
different
she's
area of
cheaper to
law.
keep her.
Yeah, not going to cover that one.
No. So,
Awesome,
guys,
awesome.
tell us a little bit about you and about your expertise in this topic.
Well, and I'll hop in, Pam, and I hate to throw David under the bus here. Fortunately, I can't personally attest to our topic today. I've been very lucky to be married to my wife, who's a dentist in Missouri for 5 years now, and she's wonderful. But it is a topic that comes up a lot in all of our practices, and I mainly focus on practice transitions. I also advise dentists and other folks on litigation and some legal matters that come up day to day. But one of the big topics I think we'll talk about today is mediation and the effect that that can have really in lowering the cost. And what everyone is scared of, as we talked about at the beginning, is the cost of divorce and really not only the personal cost, but the huge financial cost and cost on the business that it can have. So I'll turn it over to Alex, the mediator extraordinaire, to fill in a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you. So I've had a kind of broad-based litigation practice since graduating law school. And one of the big areas that I'm really interested in is looking at how we can reduce the cost of litigation to people, right? Litigation's really, really expensive. And it doesn't matter if you're a business that's a, multi-billion dollar business, or whether you're someone who's suing a contractor, right? Or whether you're in a divorce. Litigation is expensive. It's just a fact. And so the more that we can do to try to encourage resolutions to divorces, to other disputes that don't embroil the parties in years, sometimes decades of litigation, the better served we can be to reduce costs, I think, all around.
So, when should we prepare? And, I feel like we graduate from dental school, we've got all this debt. So, like, we have this sentiment like, I don't have anything. I don't know. You meet somebody great, you fall in love, you get married. And at that point, we're like, we still don't, I don't know, I don't have anything yet. But then you get into a practice, maybe buy a practice, maybe even build to multiple locations. And then maybe, you grow apart or something happens. And now you have something, but you didn't have something back then. Should we be preparing ourselves or maybe protecting ourselves before we have assets? Or is the post nuptial agreement, or post practice? I don't even know. Like, how do we protect ourselves, best protect ourselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. And at the very earliest stage, right, you can imagine different scenarios. One is, let's take the one you just mentioned, which is you marry really young, sort of before you have a practice established, right? What's going to happen is a big part of the value of that practice is something called goodwill, right? That you accumulate over time. So it's the loyalty of patients that you get, the connections, the relationship, the brand that you build. All of that is getting built while you're married. And in most instances, that's going to be part of the property that a court is going to divide between you and your spouse. And so, different states have different kind of approaches to how they deal with this type of property. The most common one is something called equitable distribution. So what that just means is when the divorce ends up happening, the court is going to take a look at the whole situation, both parties' financial positions, what the assets are, and figure out a way to equitably split those up. Now, the issue with that is what the court thinks is equitable may not be what, the dentist or either spouse thinks is equitable. So it poses challenges there. The other approach, it's less common, but some big states like Texas and California use it. It's called the community property approach. And in that approach, what you have is there's certain property that's separate, that's your own, that you come into the marriage with. So for example, if you have, some stocks that you bought when you were really young, you got lucky and bought a lot of Apple, and now it's really, really valuable. That's still yours. But everything you generate during the marriage is still part of the community. And at the divorce stage, that gets split up 50-50. So both of these schemes pose the same problem, which is if you're a young dentist, you're starting out, and then you build a really huge flourishing practice while you're married, that practice is very likely going to be maybe the biggest asset that you have to try to divide in divorce proceedings. And the easiest or the most common way to deal with this, if you want to deal with it early, is a prenup. They get a bad rap. A lot of people don't like them. But that's one of the best ways beforehand, if you want to take things out of the hands of the court, to figure out how this stuff is going to get distributed. And I'm happy to talk about that in more, some more depth as we move forward.
And I can just throw in a horror story to shock the readers who are right around Halloween. But, I have a close friend whose parents, they're in their 40s. He had built a business and they weren't dentists, but they had built a similar amount of wealth. And they go into their initial mediation for the divorce before, right after they file the petition, before they go down the road, and they come to what the mediator says is a fair agreement. And then $450,000 later of attorney's fees, they come to that same agreement 5 years later in the same court. So Alex is right. It's unbelievably expensive to litigate, to go hire experts, to value practices, to have competing experts, to have hearings. It's an incredibly expensive process. So doing things on the front end whenever possible is so important.
So if we can talk like statistics, data, you hear people say like, oh, half the marriages fail out there. And then you hear people who are actually in the game say like, well, that's not totally true, but the people who do get divorced tend to keep getting divorced, and that drives statistics. So what percentage of people actually don't make it?
Yeah, it's a good question. The stats that I've seen is that about 1 in 4 dentists is either going to get divorced or has been divorced at some point. So untangling that and figuring out exactly, hey, is it, 20% of all these marriages are failing or 30%? Hard to do, but what we do know is that about 1 in 4 dentists are going to face this problem, which, that's a pretty big number if you think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes it all the more important that folks in this profession think about if that happens to them, right? If they're not one of the lucky 75% happily married lifers, what are you going to do? How are you going to plan for that? And how are you going to minimize the impact on your finances and your practice?
How do you? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Say it makes sense too, because we see firsthand the unbelievable stress of the profession. Things can change over time, and dealing with patients and running a business, especially being a business owner, doing things on the front end, especially family planning, like a prenup agreement, it can take a lot of the stress off on the back end when you're planning at that stage in your life. So just to echo the point, the statistics certainly make sense given how much stress is in the profession day to day.
How do you bring this up? So I'm imagining, you're planning your wedding, you're excited right now. And I do believe, I don't have a prenup, but I feel like it's probably better to make a decision when you're not angry, like regardless of anything. So I do believe that. But how do you say, hi, I'm a young dentist right now, I don't have anything. So while we're married, I'm going to build this empire. And while you're here and you're making me dinner every night and we're doing this together, and we're going to conferences and I'm going to build all this stuff. And, if this doesn't work out, I don't want you to really have any of it. So can you sign this paper? Who would sign that? And how do
It's
you bring that up and actually have an effective conversation?
Yeah, no, I mean, probably not like that is my guess. That's probably going to be met with some a little bit of pushback. It's so what you're doing in a prenup is you're putting things in your and your spouse's hands, right? If you don't sign anything and you don't do anything, and the two of you fight later on, it is going to get determined by some third party, very likely, right? If you really go all the way and you never settle, you never come together, a court is going to tell you this is how things get distributed, right? So what a prenup is doing is it's giving you certainty as to what happens in the future. And it doesn't have to be the kind of super extreme mold of, hey, I'm going to keep 100% of my practice. I think that's probably something that the spouse would say, wait a minute, we gotta be careful about that. But things that it can do, for example, is set certain spousal support payments or make it easier for you to navigate the fact that the dentist has this huge asset to practice and may want to keep going in the practice and may not have the money readily available to pay out a chunk of the practice, right? So if you're thinking about splitting up, splitting up a bank account is pretty easy. You go, okay, you get $20,000, you get $20,000. Splitting up the value of a practice, it's a lot harder, right? You might either have to sell it and then divide it. It's difficult to think about how to do. And so if you try to approach those issues in a prenup agreement, you can have the certainty that in the event that something happens, you know how things are going to get divided up. So certainty, having it be in your control, I think that's probably the best type of framing that I think I would use.
And I won't name names. I once had someone come to me and say that they were going to spend twice the amount of money they were on the prenup as they were the engagement ring. So I certainly don't advise anyone to go that route. And but one point to add to that, a prenuptial agreement also does not have to be one-sided. I think that's a big misunderstanding that people have. Oftentimes, both sides, even if one side is going to greatly out earn the other side, as we see sometimes in the dentist profession and the lawyer professions. Both sides are generally represented by attorneys when a prenup is signed. And those attorneys are generally the people who are negotiating on the two people's behalf. So what we often find against the misconception that a prenup, you're going to walk away with $5,000 and a high five when you're done, it's actually the opposite. A lot of times it's a way to anticipate how to divide things in the future with an uncertain amount now. And you can set out percentages, you can set out ways to divide it out later that's fair to both sides. And oftentimes we'll find that courts won't enforce prenups that aren't fair to both sides. So we do see that come up in our practice and be an issue at times.
What are the so guessing you guys have seen some interesting scenarios unfold over time on the back end, just for dentists out there who are on, especially on the front end, and they're like, yeah, is this going to be a thing or not a thing? Like, what are the worst case scenarios that you kind of see more often than you'd like to? Do people lose a practice? Do they have to sell?
So one bad scenario I'll throw out there, and then I'll turn it over to Alex because I know he's seen many. We often hear that the issue initiating the divorce comes with a relationship with someone in the practice already. And I'm sure you all have heard stories similar to that of, a dentist, having a relationship with someone they know at work, they're the owner or they're a partner there, and that becoming an issue in the practice, not even just in their personal life in a divorce. And so one of the things that we recommend being very clear up front is that that person who's involved in an extramarital affair or something similar, that person can be subject to discovery in a divorce proceeding. So that person can be deposed by the other spouse's attorney. They can be subject to looking at their bank records or similar things if it's being alleged that the dentist spouse is paying them out of the business or out of their personal accounts. All of that can become subject to review by the other attorney and by the courts. One of the things that we recommend when you're in that position, and certainly no judgment from us, just something to consider, is to have a neutral person in your office. So someone who has training in human resources, you can actually have your office manager go get training in human resources to have that credential. Someone who can show up to a court if needed or go to a deposition and have some credibility to tell what's going on in a neutral way. So we've all heard horror stories about practices falling apart or breaking up. This is one way to protect yourself if you're in a sticky situation like that, is to have someone who can show credibility, who has some training to deal with these types of situations on the ground in your office, watching what's going on.
Yeah, the worst case type of scenario is one where you have a very contentious divorce, so the parties are not going to be able to agree on anything. And if that happens, there's a few things that usually take place, right? First thing is one spouse will file a divorce petition. And in a lot of states, what that immediately does is it stops both sides from transferring any assets unless the court approves it or the spouse gives written consent. So what that means is, let's say you're a dentist and you're thinking of selling your practice pretty soon, and all of a sudden you have a divorce petition out there. You can't sell it without court approval or without your spouse's approval. So that locks you into the practice, okay? Then the next thing that might happen is your spouse might say, well, I think this practice is worth a lot more than you've been telling me. I'm going to hire an expert who's going to value it at $2 million, $3 million. And you think, well, no, look, I think it's really only worth $1 million. So then you have to go out, you have to pay your expert. And these aren't $15 an hour type of experts, right? These are hundreds of dollars an hour to retain them, to have them work on it. And so both sides are getting these appraisals done of the practice. And in the meantime, you are continuing to do your day-to-day work, but you can't sell your practice. You can't get out of it. You don't know what it's going to be valued at in the split. And to top that off, this whole process takes a long time. It's not like there's a few weeks where you go through an appraisal and then a few weeks later it's done. Even a fully uncontested divorce, right, where neither side is contesting anything, they both mostly agree, 3 months, that's fast if you can do it in 3 months. And many of these, I mean, the example Spencer gave, 4 or 5 years, right? It can take that long. And so just imagine to yourself, if you are stuck, you can't sell your practice for that amount of time. And that's a huge weight and a huge burden, in addition to all of the obvious interpersonal burdens, the fighting, the acrimonious stuff that's happening in a divorce. And so, I mean, just the average normal divorce costs $15,000 to $20,000. And if you have one that's complicated, like valuing a dental practice, easily a 6-figure or more divorce where the sides are paying for it. And so that's the horror story. And the question is, what do we do about that? How do we resolve that?
Mm-hmm.
I always tell myself I picked the wrong profession when I see how much experts are charging to value a practice. So that it reminds me every time I see it. It's unbelievable.
I think we all have those professions we see and we're like, we picked the wrong profession. Don't worry, that's in dentistry too. David, did you hear about that dentist? I don't want to say where they are, but there was a dentist who was having an affair with a worker and decided to have a retreat. And it was at some place. And so the wife came to the retreat, and this dentist was caught cheating with the employee. And so not only did the wife discover it, the team discovered it. And the entire team walked out on this person, and they had to put a sign up on their door, I'm closed until further notice, because they had no team. Literally every last person walked out on that dentist.
Wow.
I did hear that. I did. That's
Wow.
bad.
Yeah. So you're not just hurting your spouse, you could be hurting your team and ultimately yourself in the long run. So there's going to be lots of people that listen to this podcast. Thank you for listening. But if you're already married, and while, I mean, I feel like the older I get, the more, you have friends that have been married a long time. And I always thought, which is not true, that once you hit a certain milestone, like you'd be kind of good, right? Like whether it's 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, But I will say I have lots of friends that kind of didn't see a divorce coming, and they're 20 years in. And so obviously none of us know what our futures are going to hold. So what if you're already married? Are you kind of screwed at this point?
No, absolutely not. So you still have a lot of control about how the actual divorce process happens, right? There's two types. There's the uncontested and contested divorces, right? And if it's uncontested, the parties agree on the key terms. You can do things earlier on, like we mentioned a prenup, that make that much sort of more streamlined, but you can still start by approaching this issue with, listen, how do we resolve this in a way that's minimally stressful, involves minimal litigation costs, and gets us both to separate? Because odds are good that you still have, you still have love for your partner, you've been together for a long period of time, right? And if you lean into that, that can help you avoid a lot of these costs. One great alternative to litigating, some things you might be able to agree on pretty easily, right? And other things, it might be harder, right? You might have a dispute over something or be a little bit apart. Instead of jumping to the litigation path, you can go down the mediation path. So you can reach out to a mediator. Oftentimes mediators specialize in particular areas. So there might be ones who deal with, dentists specifically a lot. And that mediator can help you navigate the remaining issues of disagreement. And usually that'll take a day, 2 days, maybe 3 days, where you iron those things out and you end that with a settlement agreement that you can then present to a court. And so you work your way into an uncontested divorce. And what you're doing is you're paying for 1 or 2 or maybe 3 days of mediation instead of paying for 4 years of litigation. And so that can really reduce the cost and the burden and the emotional draining toll of being in litigation. I see this with my clients all the time, that just being in litigation, even if you're completely on the side of, or you feel you're completely on the side of right, and you think you've had this horrible injury inflicted on you, it is still immensely stressful and immensely draining. And so avoiding that and getting out of that conflict can be a really powerful way to address a difficult moment in your life.
And I would add too, your team is going to have some sense of what's going on. And it's important to communicate with people you trust in the office, especially if you're the owner. Your team will know that forensic accounting is happening. I mean, that's the reality. They will have some sense of that the books are being pulled or that you're auditing certain materials. They will have a sense that things are changing. You don't want them to get the sense that you're going to sell or jump ship and have a cascade of people leave. It really is best to be upfront, especially with people that you trust in the office, just to let them know what's happening, give them assurance that you're not leaving, or if you are, things are going to be okay. It can really, as we talked about earlier, you can have a whole team jump ship and then your goodwill is shot because your patients can't get an appointment. So that is one thing to note. And we always mention, make sure you're upfront with the people you trust in the office and that they can help steer the ship while you're going through this process.
That's a great point. Silver lining opportunity to lead, because people really need to feel safe. And I think our ability to help the people around us feel safe, even during a tough time, if you're somebody who's listening to this or watching this and you're in that time or you're anticipating this time, you have the chance to kind of step up and bring something good. How do people get like support for all this? Because, this is a hard time for people.
So, and I'll mention this. I mean, fortunately, like I mentioned earlier, I've been happily married for 5 years, but my parents divorced. And, we all know how hard it is on children, especially when they're involved in the process too. Of course, you're going to have people in your network who've had similar experiences, and there are support groups and groups that will help you discuss all of these issues while things are ongoing. And I would also always recommend, lean on people who you have in your life, and including us, your attorneys. We're always here to help and guide you through the process. And it's very important to find someone you trust in that process, and that you feel comfortable sharing not only your financial details and aspects, but also your personal ones, because that comes up not only in the context of the court or a mediation, but in simply, how you move forward and rebuild your life, and it affects everything as you go forward.
So this is interesting. In dentistry, when somebody wants to find a dentist, they will ask their friends maybe, or they'll go online and search reviews. How do you know that your attorney is a good one? Because I can't imagine you guys are super like, read the Google reviews, what are some questions that we should really ask honestly to make sure that we really found the right match?
It's such a great question. I think most folks will have a website, and that website is always going to be designed to market themselves to you, right? So to some degree, you got to read it with a little bit of a grain of salt in there. But the things to look for are education is a good one, right? What law school? That's a starting kind of marker that a lot of folks can look at. The other one is experience. What sort of things has that attorney done, right? Have they gone and managed, 200 of these dentist specific cases, right? That might be an indication that that's a good fit. You may also get someone who's less experienced in that particular area, but when you talk with them and have an interview with them, you think that this person understands your situation and understands you and is a good fit. So it's not necessarily always the folks who have done 200 personal injury cases, 300 personal injury cases. It can often be the people that you connect with, because that person is going to have to be your advocate and has the privilege of being your advocate for the next however many years the litigation progresses. So you want to look for sort of what I would call basic competence, and a sense that they haven't been sanctioned by the bar, or there's no major complaints outstanding against them. There's not a bunch of reviews saying this person's the worst person ever and never trust them with anything, right? But beyond that, a lot of it is personal fit, and do you trust who you're working with? And I think that's especially important in this type of area, right? A divorce, a family law type of matter. It's going to get personal. You're going to share a lot of personal information with whoever is your lawyer, whoever you might choose as a mediator, and you want to make sure that you can be comfortable with that person. And so that's a really big, I think, underlooked aspect of choosing an attorney.
I always say to use the Matchbook test. If you've ever seen the show Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad, he hands a matchbook to everybody. If your attorney hands a matchbook to you, don't hire that attorney. This is my advice. But in all seriousness, one thing to add on that, a lot of attorneys will ask for a retainer for an initial consultation. I think the best ones don't, because they want you to get a sense, is this someone who I want to pay money to? Is this someone who I feel comfortable with talking to, before anything about money or fees are talked about or exchanged? So my advice, meet with an attorney who's willing to speak with you without an initial upfront retainer. That's always a good sign. Another good sign is, do they have experience mediating? In a dental divorce, you're going to need a very experienced mediator. Alex and I are very fortunate to have training during our time in law school and sense and a lot of mediation, but some attorneys just haven't seen many or gone through that process, although they may have handled many divorces. So you want to make sure that the person you're hiring has some financial background, has some background in mediation, and that you, of course, feel comfortable and trust them. That's probably the most important thing when you're looking at an attorney. So that's what I have to add. Hopefully the Matchbook test is easy, but the rest of it hopefully is something to help find somebody good in your area.
Is it important? You mentioned, dental a few times. Like, how much dental experience does this person need to have in the mediation process?
So I think it can really depend, because what a mediator tries to do is to bring two parties to a resolution, but it's the parties ultimately that are reaching that resolution and that are making the decisions. So it's very different from something like an arbitration, where the person will take all the data, look at it, and say, "Oh, this is what you should do." So to some degree, they should be familiar with kind of what is litigation, how do you value claims, and the basic facts of the dispute. But I think that you can get and use a mediator that's not necessarily particularly experienced in the dental world, as long as, with the caveat of that person's good at doing the actual mediation process, because I think that transcends practice areas. It's about finding and encouraging people to find common ground in these areas. So, for example, if you have two people that have both brought in appraisals for a dental practice, and one of them says it's worth, $1 million, and the other one's 2, both of those are probably slightly slanted in both directions, right? And if you have that data as a mediator, and you can see what the dynamics are between the parties and what's going on, I think you can navigate that landscape very effectively, even without a formal training in valuing dental practices, for example. So it's less, I think, particular dental practice experience and more, hey, does this person have a grasp of these types of mediation concepts, and can they bring us towards a resolution?
And one thing to add on that too, in terms of a mediator, a lot of times people will engage a former family court judge, and that adds a lot of credibility to someone who may not be as familiar with or may be skeptical of the process. So if you're dealing with a divorce where one party is really unwilling to negotiate or doesn't trust the system or thinks that they're not getting a fair deal, sometimes a person with a little bit more credibility, like a judge or a former judge, can step in and fill that gap. So that's one thing to consider. Oftentimes that isn't necessary, but it can be helpful in cases where you have an ex-spouse who really is not trusting the process. And you both can agree that a former judge would provide some guidance to you both.
So, long story short, is it cheaper to stay married? The answer is maybe.
It's the classic lawyer answer, right? It depends.
It depends.
It depends.
We love that in dentistry too. So I bet you there's people that are not done having this conversation and maybe have some questions for you. Would you share a great way to contact you?
Sure, absolutely. My best email to contact me is Erwig, AERWIG @gmail.com.
And
Awesome.
my email is spencer@attorneyspencer.com. You're also welcome to text or call me. My number is 918-914-1020.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for your time and your expertise. I think it's just fascinating I love having our dental guests, obviously, but I also think it's so fascinating to speak with experts that are in other industries. What do you think, David?
Yeah, life happens. It's something we all go through. It's the human element. Just because we're a dentist doesn't mean we don't have other things going on. So this has been so helpful, guys. Really appreciate your time. If you're watching, I hope you never need their help. But if you do, I think we've got a couple of great resources for you and some great advice to follow. So thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for watching or listening to the show this week. And thanks to our guests and sponsors on this episode.
Please check out our social media at Dr. Pamela_Maragliano and at Dental Economics Official.
Or you can check me out at Ignite DDS or at Dr. David Rice.
And go to dentaleconomics.com to receive dental economics. You can choose to receive DE in print or digitally, and you can also get the details of our Principles of Practice Management conference on our website.
If you have topics or guests or anything you'd like to talk about on the show, send us an email to dentistryunmaskedpodcast@gmail.com, and we will do our very best to make it happen. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.